You asked a question about the execution of the grift,
Yeah.
that why a grift is different than just a charlatan
Mm-hmm.
or an opportunist.
Yes.
And of course, you would be the one to catch this because so much in the book, I'm talking about strategy, the
Yes.
blueprint. It's
Mm-hmm.
not brainless. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just, oh, I don't know what's happening. It is actual execution. I mean, I'm sure you already knew it, but a lot of folks are missing. This isn't just, I mean, even Omarosa,
Yeah.
it was strategy. And
Yeah.
she, some folks, Stacey Dash might not have had the greatest strategy. She was kind of ahead of her time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But talk
Yes.
about the what you picked up as far as the execution of the grift.
Well, one of the things I'll be honest with the audience here, um, when you host a show, you host a podcast, whatever, you get books all the time, and you have to read them because that's part of the job. And trust me, Clay knows this. I know this. We've all been on shows with people who we know don't read their books, right? They only skim them. So when you read a book and it's actually good and you want to read more than just the required 4 chapters that you need in order to ask your questions, one of the things you start picking up is overall themes of the book. And what I liked about what Clay was talking about, look, anybody can write a book saying Republicans are terrible and Republicans are sellouts, but he puts intelligence behind it because he's like, no, these people, they have a strategy. There's a reason behind this. A charlatan is just a flim flam artist from the beginning, right? A sellout is somebody who had a set of values and then betrays those values for access to power, money, or wealth. A grift is something else. It is a scheme. It is developed as a scheme from the beginning. It is inauthentic from the beginning. Now, you can become a grifter, right? But many of the people that Clay talks about, that you're talking about in your book, are people who were grifters from the beginning. And I got to tell you this, Clay, it's really funny. So this weekend, I was talking with some friends of mine in a chat group, and somebody was talking about like Clarence Thomas, and they're like, da da da, he's so terrible, this, that, the other. And they're like, I guess people have always disliked him. And I was like, folks forget that when Clarence Thomas was up for his seat in, I guess it was 1990, when he was first up for the Supreme Court, I mean, you had Maya Angelou defending him. Black
My
people,
Derek Bell.
yes, Derek
Derek Bell
Bell.
defended him.
Black people were defending Clarence Thomas, and the best way to understand why is there's this it's very easy to find. You go to YouTube, type in Clarence Thomas in living color, and there's this hilarious sketch in living color where they kind of depict the fact that black folks had this belief that like maybe the whole thing was a long con, right? That
Right.
once Clarence got in, and this whole funny part is when one of the justices is like, Clarence, you know you have the job forever, right? He's like, oh, for real? And then suddenly he goes into AAV and he's like, let me tell y'all something about how this is really going to work, right? But it turns out he was long conning us, right?
Absolutely.
That Clarence from the very, very
Absolutely.
beginning. And I do think you could describe Clarence Thomas as a sellout and a grifter
Oh, yeah,
because
textbook. He changed the game.
yes, yes. Because if you look at what his values were, and then he sold out those values for power, and then now that he's become he getting flued out by Harlan Crow and all those other Bond villains, now you can see he is a grifter. And that's one of the things that makes the conversation in your book so interesting, because you specify those differences. You talk about what that actually is. Like I said, we can all talk about Republicans are terrible, but it's something
Right.
else entirely when you bring in people like Michael Steele. You talk about, some of the black folks who couldn't talk on the record. It's much more sophisticated, and I think a lot of people give it credit for.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting with Clarence Thomas is you're right. Maya Angelou said she would support him,
Yes.
Derek Bell. But you know who spoke out against him? Rosa Parks. I had
Yeah.
this in the book.
Yeah.
Rosa Parks said, this man is dangerous.
Yep.
Listen to me. Because he was the first Supreme Court justice ever to speak out against Brown versus Board of Education.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
when you're speaking out against Brown versus Board of Education. And then what's interesting about the grift is that it's in plain sight. I mean, he literally is on record saying affirmative action saved my life.
Yes.
Yet he is against affirmative action. And one of the other things that it's important, I'm glad you picked up, and we talked about it in depth on your podcast, is that the reason why I call it the downward spiral is it didn't start that way.
No.
Black Republicans are the first progressives. And even when you get into the 1960s, 1970s, Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, the
Right.
current GOP ignores him. They act like he didn't even exist. He was the first black senator elected by the people. He was pro-life. He was the first person to tell Richard Nixon to step down. And he did some awkward shit. There's some things he did.
Right.
You'll read it in the book. It's a little weird. But once he gets in the office, he was for the Vietnam War. Then he did, I think, what people thought Clarence Thomas would do.
Right.
During the campaign, he's blasting Stokely Carmichael. Why is Stokely in it? It's crazy. But then when he gets in there, he sees what it is, and they push him out. They literally push him out, just like they pushed out J.C. Watts, who in the beginning, J.C. is shaking, all that good stuff. But that's why I really appreciated that folks will see it's a journey. It's a trajectory. It's not as clear. Someone like Condoleezza Rice, I think she has grifting abilities here or there, but it's complicated. It's very much complicated.
Because I think also Condoleezza is a real ideologue. Like Condoleezza believes in the sort of imperial American project in a very sincere way, and she believes it in a moral way. Like she thinks American sort of empire is a moral imperative upon the world, and that differentiates her from other people who are just going to say whatever it is that they can to get wherever it is they want to get. J.C. Watts also reached that moment we talked before on the podcast. We're even talking about it now, of hitting that ceiling. You know, when J.C. Watts was the third most powerful Republican in a Republican-controlled Congress, and he still saw George Bush eliminate, I think it was his engine plant for F-15s. He's like, how are you doing this in my district? I'm third in line to the presidency, right?
Exactly.
Like, he realized that no matter what he did, no matter how much he danced, sang, bojangled, and shuffled, that he could still be treated in a disposable way. And that is the ceiling that I think is always amazing. That these Black Republicans, even when they grift, realize. Now, again, for those who have no real desire to achieve power,
right?
Okay, if you're just trying to get money, then you've got the Hodge twins, right? Then
oh my goodness, I didn't even mention them in the book.
Yeah. But those are the kinds of people where it's like, I mean, these are people who voted for Obama and were Democrats, and in order to cover their grift tracks, they like to play these games like, I red-pilled myself. No, you just saw where the money was. You didn't come to some ideologically pure. Half these people never used to vote, right? They had no political engagement whatsoever, but they saw the sort of fandom that comes with Trumpism. And we talked about this. It's like you have your sort of real Republicans from the 90s, you have your sellouts, and then you're my favorite guy said, I think he's the transition candidate.
Yes. Let's talk about that.
Yes.
So I hope this clip works. I hope I did it. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But one of the things you point out, and here we are, is that Tim Scott straddles an interesting line because he is before the clown era and after the clown era. A really interesting line. Let's play this clip. Listen to this.
So Tim Scott's grift is really fascinating, really dangerous, and it has a legislative impact with no accountability.
Tim Scott, I think, above and beyond his occasionally crazy statements that, welfare did more damage to Black people than slavery, and his claims that he doesn't see any racism, et cetera, I think he's also an example of what we talked about, the glass ceiling or the black ceiling for these candidates, because arguably here you are, this historic African-American senator from South Carolina, you're very well known, and he decides that he's going to run for president, and still the Republican Party abandoned him. Talk a little bit about this sort of abandonment issues that some of these Republicans have. The Arthur Davises, the Tim Scotts, the Daniel Camerons, the Mia Loves. You have so many who sacrifice so much to get smacked in the face. Is it something that intimidates other Republicans? Does it make other Black Republicans say, hey, I want to sign up for it because, even if I shoot for the moon and I miss, I'm a part of the stars? How does that look to other people when they see the kind of sacrifices we saw from Tim Scott?
Go to the podcast to hear my full response in the exchange Dr. Jason Johnson and I had.